So I'm Adam Englander. I'm here to talk to you about behavioral-driven API development using Symfony and Behat. I believe that's the correct pronunciation when you're not in the United States. I am a software architect for a product called LaunchKey at Ovation, which is a gigantic API. And one of the reasons that we're talking today, the reason I'm talking to you today anyway, is that there's been a change in the architectural landscape, and I think that Fabian talked about it earlier today, that Symfony is moving so it's easier to make APIs. Microservices, APIs, single page apps, things like that are going over, because APIs are taking over, right? How many people have to write an API as part of their daily day? All right, so we all know what we're talking about, right? Because once upon a time, we just wrote web applications in Symfony, and we used Twig templates, and we used forms, and we were happy because we could test all that. But nowadays, you have mobile applications. So how many people do mobile apps as part of their? Yeah. And if you're not, you probably will be, because the mobile wave is getting us all. And the way that you do that is through an API. They're just going to be an extension of your application using an API, using the same data, interacting. Single page applications, which is just absolutely taking over since React and Angular 2. It was, people wanted it before. It was really tough. It was a real pain. With React and Angular 2, it's really taking off because it's an actual framework to write applications, as opposed to a way to just make things move around on the page. But again, those also require an API. It's literally a client-server application running in your browser. And then application extensibility. So I've had some experience with this, where you have whatever application it is, but you need to integrate with other people, whether that's partners or customers. They want to deeply integrate with your system so that you don't have people manually taking information from their system, putting it into yours, or the other way around. Those require APIs. And in the new terror out there, the Internet of Things, that is taking over. We actually had an interesting conversation last night about how people are trying to figure out how they're going to which system they're going to use to control their lights. Do they still use switches? Things like that. Because the Internet of Things is taking over. And those things are all integrating via APIs. And if you're not doing it now, I'd say at least the next 5 years, you're going to have to figure out how people can talk to your application, right? Because people are just getting used to Alexa, Google Home, Siri. Those types of interactions are going to happen through some ridiculous nonsense on their side, but it's going to interact with an API for your application, and we're all going to have to get there. And then everyone's favorite buzzword, microservices. So, and I guess microservices is more than just a buzzword. Right? It is a buzzword, and people use it way too much. It's like big data. But it's really good for large teams and large applications, that when you break it out of a monolith, you can get much faster results in deploying things out. If you can separate out that logic and not have one giant application that has to be deployed and two people having to manage merge requests and things like that. But again, those things, they need APIs in order to talk to each other. And so we get to APIs in Symfony. So a lot of people raise their hands. I'm assuming those are APIs in Symfony? Show of hands. All right. So one thing that we know about Symfony is it is extensible. Right? This is the thing that brought me to Symfony at Symfony 2 Beta 3, right? Symfony 2 Beta 3 saved my life. Thank you, Fabian. Thank you, everybody that works on this, because Symfony 2 saved me from having to go to Python. Well, I guess it shortened the trip, but we were going to move to Django because it was too hard to write applications, a lot of applications, big applications in PHP. And Symfony changed that through being extensible, allowing you to inject logic in different places using event handlers, and then take bundles, which are just fantastic ways of just taking somebody else's logic and just stick it in your application with a little bit of wiring and no code on your own. You can do some amazing things. But it does bring challenges because I guess Symfony 4, this changes, but everything else you have an application bundle, right? And this is the thing that has your bootstrap code for your bundle. It's got your controllers, it's got your services, and those things are super easy to unit test, right? Because we've got Symfony dependency injection, which means everybody's using it, and you can inject all of your dependencies and do super awesome unit tests with mocking. And we all love that, right? But that's not all there is to a Symfony application, and especially a Symfony API application. You have routing. I can't count the number of times I have forgot to add a route, and it just didn't show up in my application, right? Everybody does it. Kind of some of the things that they're changing now, right? Because this just happens all the time. You need to make sure you have the correct path as well, right? One typo in the path and everything's gone. Serialization. For APIs, you're going to be dealing with serialization, hopefully. If it's large enough, you're not going to want to have to do that manually every single time, creating a JSON object. Turning your database objects into arrays that get turned into JSON is pretty terrible. But you have to make sure that it's configured properly, right? The last talk, or 2 talks ago, I was talking about he had to write his own serializer because it was just a lot of configuration. So if you're just using Symfony to do this and you're using the standard serializer bundle, you're going to have to do a lot of configuration to figure out how things get translated. Firewall. So I work for a security company, and we care a lot about firewalls. Need to make sure that the people who can get in, and the people who aren't supposed to get in don't get in. And that's a lot of testing that doesn't necessarily work so well under unit because you don't have access to it. There's cache. So if you want this thing to scale, it's going to have to cache. And you're going to have to make sure that your end user also knows how long that cache is supposed to be. So if this thing is not going to change for 5 minutes, you want to let them know, hey, don't come get this again for 5 minutes because it's not going to change. And you need to make sure the cache is working as expected and putting out those correct headers. The event dispatcher, right? You need to make sure that everything is properly registered for the event dispatcher. Symfony 4, this is going to be a little easier, but still you have to make sure that you're registering for the right events, because if you register for an event on one misspelling, right, nothing is happening for that listener because you've registered for the wrong event and it never gets triggered. Dependency injection. Dependency injection you can change, right? You're changing what classes are getting put in based on configuration values. There's a lot of things that you can do in dependency injection that depending on where you're deployed and what it's doing, your application may act completely differently. And then configs. There's another place, right? You have to make sure that your environment is configured properly. Pretty difficult to do, especially on unit testing. And then translations. So a lot of us don't deal with translations. I deal with translations, and that's making sure that my error messages are in a language that you can understand. And we're actually talking about changing keys to make more sense to actual humans to look at, so it makes more sense for them, so we have to write less documentation. So we have to make sure that we translate properly. And then app kernels, right? Symfony 4, thank goodness, stops this. But right now, you have a different app kernel if you're running in dev, prod, or test. So how do you know it works? How do you know the app kernel is configured properly to actually work? And what that means is that you have to have full integration testing, right? Every Symfony application really needs full integration testing because you have all these other pieces. I can make sure that all my code works, but I have no idea if it's going to work when it's out on the website. Just no way to know. Now, fortunately, in Symfony, you have options available already to perform integration tests. So how many people have used or are using web test case? Okay, so we're familiar. And how many people here use Behat and the Symfony extension? Okay, so there are 2 options, right? For web test case, PHP unit, and then you have Behat with the Symfony 2 extension. And you're probably using PHP unit for unit testing your controllers and services, we can all hope. And if you're not using Behat, you probably don't want to learn another tool, right? Because it's not a simple thing to come up, and it's a different concept, it's a different way of thinking. But what I want to try and tell you, and this is just my standard BDD sales job, is that Behat is going to give you a lot of things, and good, those are readable. Because it's more than just a testing framework. PHP unit is a testing framework, and it is a fantastic testing framework. But it is not a behavior-driven development tool. So because Behat is a BDD tool, it's providing additional functionality when it's used well. So one of the things it's allowing you to do is have multiple profiles to run the same test code. And so profiles allow you to connect to prod, to connect to beta, to connect to release candidate, and run the same tests against all of them. And the other thing that it allows you to do is it allows you to run kernel-based tests using that the Behat extension for Symfony 2. So you can run the same things you would normally run with web test case, but you can also then take that same thing and point it at your live servers. It also provides a way of doing acceptance testing. So how many people who do how many people do APIs? Raise your hand. How many of you that is your primary product? Very few of us, right? So if it is your primary product, that means you're probably documenting it. If it is not your primary product, you are not documenting it. How many people are documenting private APIs? Like a third of the people that raise their hand, right? And that's totally understandable. You don't have the time to do that, right? Nobody's giving you the time to go document this thing because you're probably just using it yourself. Documentation is one of the fantastic things that BDD does for you because it's documenting the features of your application, of your API. And it's also being used for, I use it personally, for acceptance. So if you're building an API that's used by other groups, you may have someone who's overseeing, a product owner or something like that, that's overseeing what's expected of your API. For me, it's my primary tool. We sell an API. That is all that we sell. And so when you have a web application or a mobile application, it's something that somebody can see and feel and interact with, and they can say, yes, this does what I think it should do. Or no, it doesn't. These are the changes that need to go for me to accept it. On an API, I can't expect my product manager to go open up a terminal, pop out some curl, and try and interact with my API. But what I can do is I can show him feature tests. And so he can go look and say, okay, this scenario is covered, this scenario is covered, this scenario is covered. If this passes, I'll accept it. And that's how we do acceptance tests. So it's providing that for you. When you do PHP unit with web test case, all you're getting is kernel tests. And that's all you're getting. So there's my little stump speech about why you should be using Behat and why you should be using BDD. Because, and strangely enough, I think most people think that BDD is for websites. And that's where I give instructions on how to do it. I teach how to use behavior-driven development and how to use Behat and how to use Cucumber for Java. I mean, it's available in everything you could possibly think of. And it's always for a website. And one of the things that I learned, and through the kind of the beauty of the kernel and the Symfony 2 extension, is it doesn't have to be that way because in reality, behavior is behavior. When you're doing behavior-driven development, you're building things for user behavior. And whether that is a human interacting with a website, a human interacting with a mobile device, or two devices talking with each other, the same general rules apply. Actor 1 acts, Actor 2 responds, right? So whether it's somebody asking for the home page and the server returns the home page, or it's your car coming into the parking lot saying, hi, I'm on the network now, and Google Home says, great, I'm going to turn the lights on. It's the same thing, it's just an interaction. Cause and effect is what you're trying to test. And so instead of dealing with this, well, actually, this, right? Because we think we're dealing with this right here. But everything that does these tests, it doesn't pay attention to what comes out visually. It's just talking HTML. So it's actually not that much different. But instead of talking HTML, you're dealing with this, which is API requests and responses. Now, these are actually part of what's going on behind the scenes when you're doing web testing anyway. Most web tests aren't so concerned with what's going on with the communication. All they really care about is that it displayed the way you expect it to display and it interacts the way you want it to interact. When you're doing API testing, it's a little more low level, but it's still basically the same thing. And the example that I have for that is when I want my application to require a login for everything, right? So if this was a web app, right, you would have a feature that says all pages require login. As a user, in order to view the home page, I must log into the website. Pretty standard feature, pretty standard set. And there's two scenarios. When I'm not logged in, it redirects to the login form. So when I log into the home page, I'm redirected to the login page. The other scenario is when I'm logged in, I see the page I'm looking for. So given I'm logged in, when I go to the home page, then I see hello Adam, because my page likes to welcome me. When you're doing that through an API, it's basically the same thing, except you're looking at different pieces. So we'll deal with this one. So the easiest way to do this for me to show it is OAuth. Don't get hung up on the fact that it's OAuth. It can be basic auth. It doesn't matter. But let's say that my feature is that all endpoints require an OAuth token, which means that you're logged in. So as an API consumer, in order to access an endpoint, I must be authenticated. So the first scenario, not logged in, shows a 401. So instead of a login page in HTTP land, we want to show a 401 unauthorized. And that's going to tell you, you need to log in. And most systems understand that. Just like your browser understands that. When you get a 401 back, it's going to pop up, especially if it has the basic auth realm it wants you to use. It's just going to pop in the little login form and put in the user and password. It's a standard. So when I access the status endpoint, then the HTTP status is 401 unauthorized. That's what 401 is. And the www authenticate header is bearer realm equals API realm. And so this is kind of OAuth talk saying, hey, you need to log in under this realm. And so your application would know that, oh, I need to go get an OAuth token and handle it the way I'm supposed to handle it. But if you are authorized, so given you have a valid OAuth token, that when I go access the status endpoint, HTTP status is 200 OK, which means you don't need to log in. So that's proved your feature. So it's just as easy to write this stuff using Behat, as opposed to unit tests. Like when I started working at LaunchKey, it was all unit tests, doing back and forth work. And this kind of like lumped together kind of pseudo functional testing, testing controllers. But again, just because you're testing controllers doesn't mean that it works, right? It doesn't mean that it works on your beta systems. It doesn't mean it works on your release candidates. It doesn't mean in staging. It doesn't mean it works on production. So that's nice and all, but how do I do kernel and live tests? Because one of the things I said that's amazing about Symfony is the ability to do the same tests everywhere. And the way that you do that is multi-profile, multi-client. So a little backstory on my use of Behat in Symfony is that when Symfony 2 came out, I was already using Behat because I had these giant applications that had no testing and stuff just broke all the time anytime you changed something. And so we had to find a way for tests that was untestable because everything was either done in the constructor or just terrible code. And so we found a tool that would allow us to have tests to make sure we didn't break the general ledger. We broke the general ledger like once every 2 releases. And the general ledger is how you bill people and how you pay people. And it was so bad that the company I worked at would just say, so if you called and said, you didn't pay me enough, and they would say, well, how much are we off? And you would give them a number. If it sounded reasonable, they would pay you. Because the likelihood that we were wrong was very high. Because we broke the general ledger all the time. It was a gigantic application with no tests. So, as we got tired of these things happening, a couple of us got moved on to this project and we just didn't accept that. So we started using Behat because it would allow us to test the JavaScript, test the interactions. We couldn't write unit tests, but we could test the functionality that we were getting killed on all the time. And we would know that we didn't break things before we went to production. Then when we moved to Symfony 2, the Symfony 2 extension came out, which meant that I could run the tests locally on my dev box, right? I didn't have to have a local server running. I didn't have to stick it anywhere so it could run. It was really, really nice, especially when you mixed in using Doctrine with a local SQLite database, right? I could get everything all completely set up and just run a full set of tests. And then they started wanting JavaScript. And it made me angry because now it meant nothing, right? Nowadays, every application I have that's a web application, it serves one page that has one tag. And that tag is called app. And that's all there is. And there's JavaScript, right? There's some script tags to load all the pieces of JavaScript, but that's it, right? It just sticks out one app tag and then it runs this JavaScript and everything else just kind of magically appears. So now I can't run that stuff locally. But what I can do is I can use it for the APIs because the APIs don't have any JavaScript, which is why I love APIs. I've got nothing against JavaScript, it's fantastic, but I'd much rather not do front-end stuff because that's not what I do. And I love APIs because I can actually work with that and get it tested. So I started using that again for my API tests. So the default profile is my development profile. right? And that's using the Symfony 2 extension, and yes, it works with Symfony 3. That was my first question. With Symfony 3, it does the Symfony 2 extension. It didn't for a while, it does now. So I think that was actually the last couple months they fixed that. So it will work with the Symfony 2 extension in Symfony 3. And I created a kernel just for that Symfony kernel. And I call that the Symfony kernel feature context. But I also have a guzzle client. And that's what I'm going to do to test my external servers, my local dev server, my beta server, my release candidate, my staging and prod. And those use the guzzle client. So it doesn't need any extensions. It's just loading my feature context and it's configuring it. There are other things you can do to configure it better. This is just a demonstration, so we'll just talk localhost. And this code is out there, and there's a link to it on the joined in stuff. So if you want to go take a look at it and see how it did, it's actually fairly simple. Most of the code is going to be here in this presentation. And so you have a context hierarchy, right? Yes, I could have done multiple contexts because it allows for that. There's a lot of things I could have done, but I want to make it super simple if you want to try and follow along. So I'm just using one abstract class and two concrete implementations. So I have an abstract context, and then I have the Symfony kernel context, and I have a guzzle client context. So the abstract context looks like this. This is most of the code inside of there. So it has one thing that's super important, which is send request. And it's using PSR7, HTTP request, or request interface and response interface. And specifically, I chose that in a minute, and you'll see why. And then it has all of the steps. So when you're doing things for making requests or dealing with the response, you're dealing with PSR7, and you're always dealing with PSR7. Super easy, right? You know what you're dealing with. You can write all these things. And so like the one example it has here is the example that we're using in the features that I had there. And that is that it asserts that a status code is a value. That's something you'll do a lot in API testing, is asserting a status code. Because status codes are really important in API development. Because if you don't return anything in the body, you better return a 204 because some clients freak out when there's no body if you return a 200. If you want to redirect them, if you create an entity and you want to redirect them or tell them where the new entity is, that requires a 201 and the new URL and the location tag, or location header. So you do a lot of stuff specifically with status codes. And this is all that you need. So we moved to the guzzle client context. So guzzle client context, all you need is guzzle, right? And then the config from the profile. So in the constructor, it's passing in the config. It makes a client based on the config, and that's all there is to it. And then when it does the send request, guzzle already speaks PSR7. So it's just using that request. I suggest putting a trycatch if you want to do this around guzzle, because guzzle absolutely throws an exception anytime it's a non-200 or 300. So if you want to go and check and see if it's a 401, if you don't catch that exception and then put that response somewhere, it's just going to blow up. You're going to get a failure on your test because it threw an exception. So you always want to make sure you can validate your actual codes and be able to see, like, you don't want it to throw an exception. You want to be able to say, hey, I was expecting 401, but I got 200 or I got 500 or whatever the case may be. So then you move to the Symfony kernel context. And it's a little more, has a few more pieces to it. So you need the Symfony 2 extension for Behat. You also need the Symfony PSR HTTP message bridge, which allows you to move between PSR7 and Symfony kernels. And you need an implementation. And the easiest one for me to find, especially because it works well with the bridge, is Zend Diactoros. So is that a lot of stuff to stick in your project? Probably, but it's only being done on the dev include, so it's only there for testing. So it's not going to be in your final product, so I don't think you need to worry about it too much. Then you get to the kernel context. So in here, we're implementing kernel-aware context, which is what you get from that Symfony 2 extension. Is it's going to inject the kernel using a setter into your context. And then we're extending the abstract feature context. But in our constructor, we're building the Diactoros factory from the Symfony HTTP translation between PSR7 and that. So setting and receiving the request response is a little more work. But again, it's not a lot, right? It's still only 7 lines of code. So you get the request, which is PSR7, and we build out methods. It's as you get more complex in the things that you're sending, it's going to get more complex. You get the response back, and then you just use the PSR7 factory to create a PSR7 response, and you return that back. And that's all there is to it, right? Super, super easy, right? For me to figure out how to do it was super complicated. Like, oh, great, I remember like when the PSR7 came out, Fabian like tweeted out immediately, aha, I've done it. I've got a bridge. I'm like, great, how do I use it? And then I had to have the implementation. So that took a little bit. I mean, a little bit meant like a couple of hours. But I was able to do that. And so now I have web test case, so I can run really fast, full suite integration tests. They're the exact same tests that I'm going to run against my beta server to make sure that it's properly configured and installed, and my RC server, and my staging server, and my prod server after I release. So I have one set of tests I can use for everything, which is amazing and is super awesome. And you can only do in Symfony-based products from what I've seen, right? The APIs that I'm working on now are not Symfony 2 based. And I'm trying to find a way to do this, and I cannot. So it makes me very, very angry that I can't do this. So I'm really thankful to the Symfony team for building this test client that's accessible through the kernel. So now that we've got that, I've got some lessons from the trenches. So I've been writing behavioral tests for APIs for a few years now, and currently working on my largest product. So the launchkey multifactor authentication API has 41 unique paths and 130 handler methods, because you have post, put, patch, delete, whatever the case may be. And about 10,000 lines of code dedicated to the API, and 120 libraries. It's a lot of libraries. So to cover that, I have 55 feature tests and 328 scenarios and about 3,000 lines of step code. That does not include annotations or any of that kind of nonsense. It's just actual step code. And that's a lot of code. So the first thing I can tell you is split features by functionality, not by paths. So we made this mistake when we started backporting. We were using other testing methodologies that were failing, and I finally got them to agree to, hey, let's try this BDD stuff, and we'll start building the stuff. And the easy way to figure out where things were and what was done and what wasn't done was to just do it by path. Right? I have a feature called, let's see, it would be public v3 ping. Well, that's a feature. Well, it's not really a feature, but it's a path. But that's fine, and we did all of that, and then someone says, great, we need to make a change to this feature, and I'm like, I have no idea where the tests are for that, because it's all by endpoint. So I've got to go change all these endpoint tests because they have multiple features across the same endpoints. So that can get messy. It may seem like a good idea in the beginning, it's not a good idea. Break functionality in multiple contexts like you would bundles. So especially when you're talking about things that have to clean up after themselves. Good tests clean up after themselves, especially if you're running it against production. So I break it out based on state, so that if I have something that is managing a particular entity, that's in its own context. It's managing its state in the context, so that after it creates all these things to be able to interact, it keeps a record of those and then goes and removes them after it's done, so that we don't have millions and millions and millions of entities out there that were just created for tests or just taking up space. If you have complex step code, unit test that code. So for my particular API, it's got some complexity in that we use JWE to encrypt all of the data. The request and the response is encrypted. The data is also signed and provides authentication via JWT with some extensions on top of JWT. So the code to actually build a request is really complex. And as we start adding features to what it can and can't do with JWE and JWT and how things go in there, I have to refactor that code. And not having tests means I break stuff all the time. So I have to add tests for my tests. So it may sound odd, but if you have high complexity in your testing code, you may need to write tests because you're going to have other developers going for it, or you may have what I have, or at least I've had, is that I will make the hard stuff, and then we have someone who's a QA automation person come in and do the rest. And they will break a lot of things not knowing what's going on because I built it and probably didn't talk to them enough about it. But test there will let them know that, hey, I made this change and it's breaking this piece over here. So when the tests fail, you know that your unit tests are failing because your tests are bad, not you think that you've broken the code because your integration tests are failing. The other thing that we did is we exposed endpoints for setup or teardown. So beforehand, there were two things that we tried. One is we tried, okay, great, well, we'll just go find our admin console and we'll go do everything we need to set up the test in the admin console. And man, is that slow. And you have to use Selenium, so that requires a grid, and then you have to manage the grid, and that is a mess. So if you're using Selenium and you're having really good results with it, come talk to me, because I want to find out what you're doing, because I'm having just a really tough time. So we decided not to do that. And so we started using shared pre-configured pieces, but that means that your tests are not atomic. So if you're using one particular entity's pre-configured and you want to test that you can add siblings to it, or you can add children to it, and you have another test that tests the counting of a list of them, that shows the list of the returns, they can interfere with each other. But you get the wrong number of pieces in there, and so your tests can't be run in parallel, and if you have a large test suite, you may want to run it in parallel. And also, you can never determine, in Behat, it's fairly repeatable, but in a lot of these systems, you can't determine when each one will run. They're just, it will run, but you can't tell the order. It won't guarantee the order. Test a feature only once. And this is not just for APIs, all right? If you're doing Behat, test a feature only once. Every step that is not testing the feature should be a given. If you're doing given, when, then you're testing something twice. Make sure that everything that's set up is in a given, whether it's in a background or in your actual scenario, make sure it's in a given. Because when you know when it fails at the given, it's not that feature that's broken, which is really important. It's really important to know which feature is actually broken. And then every given needs to be tested in another feature. So it's super important that if you have setup, that it's actually tested. So when it fails and it doesn't work, you have another feature that's breaking and you know that, oh, that's the feature that's broken. I mean, one of the super powerful things about using behavior-driven development and tools like Behat and Cucumber is that you can make intelligent decisions about what's broken. If I have unit tests that are failing, someone will come and say, we've got to release this, we've got to release this. Well, the unit tests are failing. Well, what's not working? Well, it's probably, based on the test that's failing, it should be this piece and this piece, but there might be a couple more. Right? That's not a really good answer. When you have these behavioral tests, I can say that, well, on this feature, this scenario is not working, and on that feature, that scenario is not working. So you decide if you want us to put out the new stuff or not with a really good understanding of what's not working. And it's not going to be my butt because I told you the wrong thing was busted. And you have customers that are calling complaining that their stuff doesn't work when I told you it was going to be fine, because I don't like doing that. So I guess, again, this is not specific to APIs, but it's for everything. And I've been bitten more times by this than anything else, where you just have things failing all over the place. Between this one and the previous one, not knowing what's failing is, you may as well just go back to unit tests. Fail to assert false is true. It's just as good. All right? I moved to Behat because I got tired of fail to assert false is true in unit tests. And this is what it's given me, and it's given me a lot. So I made sure to save time for questions. So does anybody have any questions? The code that I was talking about, the examples there's a full example, a full running example. A link to it is on GitHub. It's on my joined in. The slides are also there if you care. And please rate the talks. We love to hear this. This is a new talk. I've never given it before. And the timing's probably off a little bit. But let me know how you felt about the content and whether or not you thought it was useful. So any questions? Question?
I was wondering if you could go back to the slide with the features and the scenarios that you were doing.
Sure. Features, scenarios. This one or the other one?
This one works. I just wanted to see what the given looked like.
Right. Yeah, so given I'm logged in. And so what you want to do is you want to be able to reuse steps, but you don't want them to be complicated. So, and this is something I've gone back and forth. So that feature, the login feature is, if I go to the login page and I fill in this in the form and I submit this, then I'll be logged in. But you don't care, right? All you care is that you're logged in. And if how that login happens changes, you don't want to have to go rewrite all these things, all right? So I've gone back and forth on both, but I've ended up here because if it's something that your user understands, that a normal business person coming to your app, given that I'm logged in, if they know what that means and if they can understand what that means, you don't have to be any more verbose than that. Any other questions? Yeah?
How do you ensure that you're safely testing against production?
So how I ensure that I'm safely testing against production is you have to know your system. So on our system, we have a set of credentials that can create root level entities, and we create new root level entities. So we're not dealing with anybody else's accounts. We're not dealing with anybody else's entities. It's basically the same credentials we use for admin because we use the same APIs for our administrative console and our tools and our utilities as we actually publish. Just some of them aren't accessible without specific credentials. So we use those credentials that we expose to be able to do that, and so we can create a completely separate account aside from anybody else's, and we can test everything we did test and then come back and clean it up when we're done. Any other questions? Yeah.
I just want to point out that Symfony 2 extension is not really maintained anymore, and because of that, I would suggest trying something else. It's also a Symfony 2 extension, but it's from friends of Behat. It's worth trying and giving a shot. They developed this, and they've got super cool stuff there. So that's all I wanted just to say.
Okay, so what he was saying for the people who can't hear and the people that are recording is that there's another plugin, there's another extension as well from the Friends of Behat.
Yeah, actually.
So there's another one. I saw that one too, and it seemed new, but I had a lot of experience with this particular one and how it worked, so I went with that one. But whichever one works for you, fantastic. And I think this one recently, just only like a month ago, supported Symfony 3. So it's slow moving for sure, if not being maintained well at all. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, I thank you for coming, and I will be here the rest of today and most of tomorrow if you have any other questions.